Want to learn how to create this cute little basket bed? Then stick around and I'll show you exactly how. For today's tutorial, you will need a 41 peg round loom and your looming hook. You're going to need some super bulky either 6 or 7 yarn. I'm using 7, and I did unfortunately lose my label for the yarn, but I looked up on Michael's where I purchased this and they have the actual yarn. And it's also on clearance right now, so it would be a good time to get your yarn. Color is also called mustard if you wanted to know, and it's really, really soft. The one thing about this yarn is it does shed a lot, but that shouldn't be a problem for the bed as long as you're careful with the yarn. Then you're going to need some basic condiments such as a crochet hook for helping you weave in the ends. This is optional. And a plastic or metal yarn needle and some clippers or cutters. These are my yarn cutters that came with the kit I bought, and those are your supplies. I would also suggest that you use a clothing tape measurer to help you keep track of how long your item is. So to start off, we need to make a slip knot, and again, you can just tie this around your anchor peg, but I would suggest making a slip knot because it's easier. So I make my slip knots by basically taking the top loop over the bottom loop like that. And I have more detailed tutorials on that, so check out my playlist, and that goes over it in a little bit more detail. Okay, so now my yarn has been fastened to the anchor peg, and we're going to start off with the cast on. One quick thing to keep in mind is we are starting to work from the top of the bed. We are not starting from the bottom, we are starting from the top, because as we go down to the bottom, I would like to experiment around with ways to make sure that the bed stays sturdy, so that's the whole reason why we are starting from the top. So for this cast on, you are just going to wrap every single one of these pegs and make sure that you keep your loops on the bottom of the pegs because we're going to go ahead and put a new layer of a different kind of stitch over these. And I actually learned this technique from lumahat.com, and it's a fun technique and it makes the cast on not too crazy, so it's pretty simple. So continue wrapping all of your pegs until you reach the end of your loom, which is peg number 41. I reached the end, and now I'm going to lay my yarn over the peg and brace it behind the peg, and then I'm going to lift the bottom loop over the top of this loop. And then you're going to go to the next peg and repeat the same thing. This is a U-wrap version of the stitch, and we are mixing up the U-wrap and the E-wrap stitch to create our cast on. So this is still part of the cast on, and you will just continue going around the loom until you reach the end of your loom, and that's that. You have just completed your cast on, and before we do anything else, let's take off the anchor peg loop that was securing your yarn in the beginning. And it's okay to take it off early. We just don't want that yarn to get too tight. So now what we will be doing is we are going to purl for quite a long time. So purling is when you go through the top of the loop down, and then you move your working yarn under the loop, grab it through, and pull it up until you get a new loop. Now you're going to pop the old loop off of the peg and put the new loop back on the peg. So you are going to purl for 5 inches. So that's where your trusty measuring tape is going to help you. And I do not have an exact row count. I actually mostly knit by measurement. So it's up to you to count your rows if you care about that. But I'm just going to go by inches or length. And I will meet you back here when you have completed 5 inches of your purl. And this is going to start the brim of the bed. And it'll make it look a little bit more puffy and will keep it sturdy. So it's important that we have a pretty sturdy, tight base. So the purl's really good with that. I'll meet you back here after 5 inches. I completed my 5 inches of purling earlier, and this is what it should be looking like. A purl on a loom usually has a bumpiness to the outside and then an inside out look on the outside. Then I actually changed my stitch to E-wrapping. And E-wrapping is explained in one of my playlist videos if you want to see it in more detail. But I actually started E-wrapping my piece after my 5 inches of purls. And if you're wondering what these knots or loops are along the outside of my work, this is actually from when I was reattaching my yarn because I got some insane knots from this yarn and I had to cut my yarn and keep retying. Luckily, these will not be shown in the project once we fold this, so these will be gone. I E-wrapped for a total of 8 inches. So this is 8 inches approximately from the brim of the purl. And there are 3 reasons why I decided to do the E-wrap. The first reason why I switched to E-wrapping is because I wanted to save you time. This project alone is going to take a little while, and I really didn't want to slow you down or bog you down for maybe weeks as a beginner with this project. It took me a few hours just to get 5 inches of purling done, and that wasn't really that nice for me. So I decided to switch to a faster stitch that uses all the pegs all at once and is a little bit easier to go with. And it ended up only taking me about an hour to get 8 inches of this E-wrap. So that's the first reason. The second reason is to mix up the stitches. So when this bed is all done, this is actually going to look really cool because the brim or the top piece is going to be purled, and then when we fold this back like a hat brim, you're going to have all those E-wrapped stitches after that. So it kind of mixes up the stitch, and I liked that style anyway, so I decided to roll with it. And the last reason was to make the project bigger overall. The E-wrap stitch is known to create bigger projects than most stitches, so I went with trying to make the project a little bit bigger because it is going to be on the small side no matter what. So it's not going to be a huge bed, but it will be a lot bigger than the original project. So pause the video to do 8 inches of E-wrap stitch. If you would like to see the E-wrap stitch in actual detail, then you can click above to the playlist where I discuss all the stitches that I mainly use in my knitting. I'll see you in a little while, and we will begin to start actually forming the bowl part of the bed. After you finish your 8 rows, now it's time to take your project, and we're going to pretend that we're working with the hat. You will take your entire project inside out through the loom, like this. Now remember, I have all of these little knots from reconnecting my yarn, but I'm just going to simply ignore that and make sure that I'm tucking in everything because it won't show after this project is done. So first you will go and find the original loop, and this one isn't too hard because it's the one that has our slip knot attached. So it should be this one right here, and you will take it and put it on your first peg like this. And you'll notice that you'll still have the little slip knot tail. What I usually do with the tail when I'm doing a hat brim in general is I actually put it inside my work. In this case, I'm going to cut the tail because it's pretty long, and then I will re-put my loop back on the peg. Now, even as a beginner, this may seem daunting, but it's actually very simple. So you're just going to take the loops one by one, and this should be pretty easy. If it's not easy and your work is tight and fighting you, then that might be your tension, or that could just be a problem with your yarn in general. So sometimes some yarns just don't like to do this, especially if you're using triple strands, but this should work no matter what you do. So you're just going to take every peg and put the loop on them. So every loop, you're going to see this little chain here, kind of, and all these different loops, and you're grabbing the next loop over. You'll know if your loops are stretched in a different way that shouldn't be stretched. If you look down here and you see that your loops are kind of slanting over, then that might mean that you took a loop too far. So again, you're just taking every single loop and you're putting it back onto the peg as if you were starting over. As you get down to your final loops, you will just place them on as normal, and the last loop always seems to be the hardest because it's really hidden there, but I usually go behind the peg and lift my finger up to expose that loop, and it should be there. If you don't have a loop there, that means you accidentally took a loop too early over here and you might have to redo everything. But in this case, I was able to get away with that and find it, and the stitches are looking pretty even on the rows here. So now don't forget about the tail so we don't have to do this later, and instead of having to weave in later, you just put your tail into the crease between these 2 rows that you've just created, and once we start folding up this crease, you will not have anything exposed. So remember all those loops that were on my project? They are all now hidden inside and they are no longer going to be seen. All right, just as if we were E-wrapping, we are going to start with the last peg and work our way to the beginning. Now I just noticed that my working yarn is actually poking out between the last peg and the peg before that. And this should be over here. It should be starting right above our anchor peg. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm just going to lift that last loop and put my yarn over that loop right in between where it was supposed to be. And the reason why that actually happened is when I was folding the loops back on, my working yarn actually got tangled here. I'm also really sorry for the popping that may be coming through the audio. I definitely do not have the greatest audio, so I'm really sorry about that. And when I'm filming in here, it's always a little bit more echoey. When I'm making hats, this is my favorite part, and we are actually creating a brim. So if I was making a hat in this case, this would be the brim of the hat, and we would be closing it on the loom. So it works a lot differently than most projects, but basically, you are just going to lift every single bottom loop. And in this case, I actually ended up pulling this loop completely off. And if that happens to you, simply put the loop back on. Now, one thing you're going to notice if this does happen is it's going to be a pain in the butt to get it back on. So luckily I kind of got lucky. Oh wait, no I didn't. So I do this all the time because I lift my loops pretty quickly. But there we go, so it's still on there and you should still have your 2 loops there, and I'm trying to see if I can locate them. I may not have both loops on, so if I don't, I'm going to go back and lift the other one on, then I'll lift that one over. So it's important, if you just want to avoid this problem, you simply just put your finger on that loop and position it so that you can get the other loop over. And as you get through the loom, you're going to notice that your loops will get tighter, and that's okay. As long as they're not too tight to the point where they are actually not lifting on your hook, then they should be no problem, but they are gonna really get tight. So you'll notice that your tension will change a little bit, but since we're almost to the end of this bed, that's not going to matter too much, and it'll hold up better. So keep lifting all your loops and making sure they don't pop off like mine. And yeah, see, it's just happening again. So basically you're just going to put that back on. This is actually a good learning lesson. It just teaches you to be patient because I am not a patient knitter. I really like getting things done fast, but at the same time that kind of slows me down in a way. So anyway, just keep popping off all your loops and I will see you at the end of the loom. Okay, so we are back down to 1 loop per peg. We only have a few more steps left, and the first thing we'll do is do an E-wrap row. And again, E-wrapping is just going around your pegs like this. I have a detailed video on how to do this, and I'm sorry if I didn't go into detail in the beginning with the brim, but I really was just trying to move along with this project and make it easier for some of you who aren't beginners, and you don't have to really sit through that or have to fast forward through that. But as a beginner, and especially since this video does say beginner, I would definitely go back to my playlist and I go over how to do the E-wrap in a lot more specific detail, or you can just see it now. So I just wrapped all those pegs front to back, and now I'll just lift all the bottom loops. Again, you're going to notice that your tension is going to be a little hard, and my tension is actually okay for now. It's definitely heavy with the loops. I can tell that it's straining on me a little bit, but as long as you don't snap your yarn, that's definitely good. And this yarn actually is susceptible to snapping pretty easily, so I definitely have to be very careful with that when I lift my loops. So continue on down the row, and then we will do a row of purl, then a row of knitting, and we'll start getting ready to bind off. So now it's time to do a last row of purl, and again, the reason why I also started with the E-wrap stitch is because the purl isn't always a beginner-friendly stitch. So again, the purl is just taking your hook through that first loop and making a new loop. So again, you go down through that loop, you grab your working yarn that's underneath, then you pull it through and you create this extra big loop. And then you pop the original loop off the peg and place the new loop on by tightening your yarn. So again, this is the purl. And you can see that it's definitely a time-consuming stitch. It's a lot more time-consuming than most of the stitches I've used, except for the flat knit. And the flat knit is definitely not a beginner-friendly knit at all. Continue purling all the way to the end of the row, and then we will finish off this entire project with an E-wrapped row. So meet me back at the end of this row. Our very last row before we bind off is going to be an E-wrap row. So all the way around, just wrap your pegs from back to front, and it's pretty easy, and it's a lot easier than working the pegs one by one. Now it's a good idea to have all of your weaving in equipment ready because we are getting ready to bind everything and then weave everything in. There are two ways you can do this bind off. The first way is by wrapping your yarn all the way around the loom, like this no matter what, for both bind offs. And then you would cut the yarn right about here, take your yarn needle, and thread it through, and then you would go through all of these loops as if you were doing a hat, and lift all of these loops and load them onto your needle. This is called a drawstring cast off, and we do this in two different ways, but I'm doing it in the second method that I know. And I'm just gonna go down through the loop as if I am to purl. Then I'm going to grab my little tail of yarn as if I'm purling and make a new loop. But instead of just doing it as a purl stitch, I'm just gonna pull that loop all the way out until now I actually have my yarn through and securing that stitch. So the whole point of this is to secure all the stitches and pull them tight. Again, I'm just gonna go down, grab that yarn as if to purl, pull it up and make a loop, and just pull the loop completely. And that is as easy as that. And you'll notice as you go along that you're going to get this line where the yarn is actually going through all the stitches and loading them all onto this yarn. So it's a very simple cast on. It's not a hard method. And if you want to use the needle method, which is just as similar, then you can use it. It's actually the same thing. As I mentioned before, this yarn is super fragile and it ended up not working very well with my bind off, so I ended up having to retie on some more yarn after I just got done saying that I don't like doing that, but I did it because I started running out right along here because I was actually cutting my yarn every time it frayed because, as you can see, it just shedded everything right here and it was starting to snap and fray as I started pulling it through. So I ended up having to hand pull it, and if you look carefully at the time lapse, you'll see me pulling my yarn because I unfortunately was not able to preserve it long enough to get to the end. But we made it to the end. So now it's time to actually do the exciting stuff, and we are just going to lift all of the loops off of the pegs completely. So all these loops are just going to be lifted off. There's nothing else involved. And of course I have that knot there, so I'm going to have to deal with that. And luckily, if you have any knots at all, if you happen to do the same yarn as I did, or you happen to just accidentally make a mistake and have to reattach the yarn, then it's easy to hide the yarn, so that'll be okay, but I didn't like doing that. So, okay, now you're just going to lift your entire project out of the loom, and now we have our bed. So we are actually going to start by very carefully and gently pulling this string, which has now created our drawstring. Now, since I have a knot here, this is going to be a pain to get it through the drawstring, but you can use the help of your trusty loom knitting hook and get that knot through. And once it's through, it won't be a problem. Just look how shredded that yarn is. It almost gave a couple times. So I definitely had to be very careful. But now our drawstring has been pulled closed, so you see the point of it. And we're going to thread our yarn needles and make a knot, kind of as if we are sewing, except this is a lot easier. And again, if you're using the same exact yarn I'm using, which I doubt, I have learned a few things about this yarn, and it's definitely not the greatest for making this particular project. It worked for the first half, and then once we started getting down to it, we noticed that this just wasn't going to work. So we are still going to make this work though, and we're going to go and we're going to sew up the bottom of the hole. I am not a sewer. I really don't even know a lot about sewing, so I just kind of do my own thing here. I go between the loops and I just lock them together. The whole point is to sew up this hole that we've created, and it's pretty simple. You're just going to keep winding your yarn around, and I usually just go through the bottoms of those loops and then up. Run through here with my needle and just look for any places that can possibly be showing that shouldn't be showing, or extra holes. Sometimes in your fabric you can develop holes for a number of reasons. So I'm just going to go through here and I'm just going to kind of weave in as I go, and I'm not seeing anything in particular that's bothering me, so I'm just going to weave my yarn in now. And weaving in is pretty simple. You're just going to go in the loops from the outside or the inside. In this case, kind of go on the outside and pick up random loops until my yarn has been zigzagged and it's not going to be pulled out. You can also use your crochet hook for this, and I will actually undo my yarn from my needle and I just pull and it will come out. And then I take the crochet hook, and with the help of the crochet hook, I'm going to go into no loops in particular, and I will pull that yarn into those loops like this, and it should come out. We are now going to cut this. We're now done, and you cut it as close to the fabric as you possibly can, and I have a nice little sewed up bottom and lots of shedding to be seen here, so sorry for that. We now have our finished bed. I'm really happy with how this turned out, especially with this yarn. I was still pretty apprehensive about using it, and it did give me a few problems, but I worked through them. So if you had some issues too with your yarn, hopefully you were able to work through it and make it look good no matter what. And the 2 layers definitely worked. You can see that the bed stands up on its own and it should accommodate. You'll also notice that this bed is pretty small. So again, it's not going to fit a cat. If you wanted this to fit, you're going to have to make a lot of adjustments. And the 41 peg loom is the biggest loom in a round loom kit, but there are custom looms you can get that are a lot bigger and have more pegs. And those custom looms you can actually buy from Sindwood Looms. I would highly recommend them. I myself have not personally purchased a loom from them, but I have seen them, and I see a lot of YouTubers that get their looms from them. Check them out if you were ever interested in getting a custom big loom. But other ways that you could make a bed that's big enough for a dog or a larger cat definitely is to use a lawn loom. It's not going to make a round object exactly, although there are ways that you can do that, but it will create something to the point where it will still work as a bed. So if you want to see a tutorial about that, leave a comment down below, and I would definitely like to experiment with that. That would definitely be a video that may work or may not work, so we'll see if I can pull that off. But for this being my first project I've actually created myself, I'm definitely really happy with it, and it took a little bit of work getting it planned out and making sure it was going to exceed my expectations. I hope this video was super helpful to you and that it gave you a lot of inspiration and was a quick tutorial for you to learn. I definitely had a very fun time actually putting this together and seeing it work out, despite the fact that my yarn wasn't exactly the best for this particular project. If you need washing instructions with your bed, I would really recommend that you only wash it if you need to. And if you're using this particular yarn, I would really suggest that you hand wash the item. Do not put it in the washing machine. Definitely with any knitted project, do not dry clean it or put it in the dryer, and do not iron it or bleach it, anything like that. And usually your yarn label will say that, but some yarn labels will say, oh yeah, you can just put it in the dryer anyway. Don't listen to the labels. That never works out. And especially with this yarn and how delicate it really is, I would really suggest that you hand wash this with dish soap in your hands and warm water, and then air dry it. With any garment, air dry it. Even though this little bed is small, it's still perfect for taking pictures of my baby bunnies and smaller cats. If you'd like to see another tutorial based on a larger bed for dogs and cats, then please comment your thoughts down below. Also, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to RAYA Knits and give me all of your project suggestions down below. Bye!